Everyone in town called the old Caldwell farm a cursed patch of dirt. When Sawyer inherited the barren wasteland, his family laughed. He was bankrupt, desperate, and living out of his car. But beneath the rotting barn lay a secret that would make him a millionaire and a target. The leather chair in the law office groaned under Sawyer's weight. It was the only sound in the room, save for the rhythmic, maddening tick of a grandfather clock in the corner. Sawyer sat with his hands clasped between his knees, staring at the faded Persian rug. He carried the exhausted posture of a man ground down by a brutal divorce, a failed contracting business, and a mountain of debt that kept him awake until dawn every night. Across the mahogany desk, his older sister Brooke sat rigidly, her arms crossed. She had always been the practical one, the one who married a vice president of a regional bank and moved to a gated community in Seattle. "I will be brief," Warren said, adjusting his half-moon spectacles. "Your great-uncle Harlan was not a wealthy man in the traditional sense. His liquid assets amount to exactly $14,000. Brooke scoffed softly. "And the land? The property? 42 acres of unincorporated agricultural zoning," the lawyer replied, sliding a yellowed manila folder across the desk. "As per the stipulations of the will, Brooke, you are entitled to the liquid assets. Sawyer, you are bequeathed the land and all structures upon it. The title is free and clear, no back taxes." Brooke exhaled a sharp breath of relief. "Thank God." "Sawyer, you can sell it for scrap, maybe get a few thousand from someone looking to park an RV. I do not want anything to do with that dust bowl." Sawyer stared at the deed. Blackwood Farm. It was not a farm, not really. It had not produced a single crop in decades. Uncle Harlan had been the family eccentric, a paranoid, reclusive man who spent the last decades of his life patrolling his property lines with a rusted Winchester rifle, screaming at surveyors, and driving off the few neighbors who dared approach. When Harlan died of a stroke at an advanced age, he had been dead for some time before the mail carrier called the sheriff. "I will keep it," Sawyer said, his voice raspy from disuse. Brooke looked at him as if he had lost his mind. "Sawyer, you are currently sleeping in a Honda Civic. You cannot afford a property. You cannot even afford the gas to drive out there." "It is a roof," Sawyer replied quietly, picking up the deed, "and it is mine." 2 days later, Sawyer's Civic bounced violently down a severely rutted dirt road in southern Idaho. The landscape was unforgiving, endless stretches of sagebrush, baked earth, and jagged basalt outcroppings that shimmered in the punishing July heat. When he finally pulled up to the rusted wrought iron gate bearing the faded letters Caldwell, his heart sank into his stomach. The main farmhouse was a disaster. The porch roof had caved in, the windows were either shattered or boarded up with rotting plywood, and the weather-beaten siding was peeling off in long, gray strips. 100 yards away stood the barn, a massive sagging structure that looked like it was being held together by nothing more than termite spit and gravity. Sawyer killed the engine. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy, and oppressive. He spent the first while just trying to make the front room of the farmhouse habitable. He cleared out mountains of yellowed newspapers, ancient tin cans, and broken furniture. He slept on a camping mattress on the floor, eating cold beans from a can, sweating through the humid nights. He was miserable, but for the first time in years, he was not dodging calls from collection agencies. He had completely fallen off the grid. One day, the isolation was broken. Sawyer was out by the barn trying to salvage a decent piece of lumber when he heard the crunch of tires on gravel. He turned to see a pristine black Mercedes G-Class SUV rolling up his driveway. It looked entirely alien against the backdrop of the desolate farm. A man stepped out. He was in his late 40s, impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit that must have cost more than Sawyer's car. He did not seem to notice the oppressive heat, adjusting his designer sunglasses as he approached. "Sawyer Caldwell," the man called out, offering a bright, practiced smile. "Who is asking?" Sawyer leaned on a rusted crowbar, wiping a mixture of sweat and grime from his forehead. "Derek Langston," the man said, extending a manicured hand that Sawyer did not take. Langston smoothly withdrew it, unbothered. "I represent Horizon Ridge Holdings. First off, my condolences regarding your great-uncle. Harlan was a fixture in this county." You did not drive out here in $100,000 truck to offer condolences, Sawyer said flatly. Langston chuckled. Straight to the point. I like that. Horizon Ridge is looking to acquire contiguous parcels in this valley for a massive solar farm initiative. Your acres are right in our footprint. The land is agriculturally dead, Mr. Caldwell. The water table dried up years ago. The structures are a liability. Get to the number, Langston. Langston reached into his inner jacket pocket and pulled out a crisp white envelope. Given the condition of the property, we are prepared to offer you $60,000 cash. We can close soon. You sign the papers and you can drive back to civilization with a fresh start. Sawyer looked at the envelope. $60,000. It would wipe out half his debt. It would get him an apartment. It was a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. He reached out and took the envelope, opening it to see a drafted contract. But as his thumb brushed the paper, he hesitated. He looked past Langston toward the sagging barn. Why would a corporate holding company send a senior acquisitions man in a luxury SUV to a dead-end dirt road for a measly 60 grand? Horizon Ridge could have sent an email, a letter, or a junior associate. They were eager, too eager, and Sawyer, having spent years in the contracting business dealing with shady developers, knew the smell of blood in the water. The water table is dry, Sawyer said slowly. The soil is alkaline. There are no major transmission lines within miles for a solar farm to tie into. Langston's smile tightened just a fraction. We build our own infrastructure. It is a long-term investment. It is a lie, Sawyer corrected him, handing the envelope back. The property is not for sale. Langston did not take the envelope. He stared at Sawyer, the friendly facade melting away into something cold and sharply calculating. Mr. Caldwell, I know your financial situation. I know about the bankruptcy. I know about the judgment against you. $60,000 is more than this dirt is worth. I would hate to see you lose it to the bank when you fail to pay the county reassessment taxes next year. Get off my land, Sawyer said, gripping the crowbar a little tighter. Langston stared at him for a long, silent moment. We will be in touch, Sawyer. Be careful out here. Old farms have a lot of hidden hazards. Langston turned, got into his Mercedes, and drove away, leaving a plume of choking white dust in his wake. Sawyer watched until the car disappeared over the ridge. His heart was hammering against his ribs. He had just turned down salvation. He looked down at the dirt beneath his boots. What are you hiding? He thought. The encounter with Derek Langston lit a fire under Sawyer. Whatever Horizon Ridge wanted, it was here, on this property. For the next while, Sawyer became obsessed. He walked the perimeter of the acres, mapping every rock formation, every dried creek bed, and every dead tree. He found nothing but rattlesnakes and sagebrush. His attention eventually turned back to the collapsed barn. It was the only structure Harlan had fiercely protected. Sawyer remembered his mother telling him stories of how Harlan would sit on the barn roof with binoculars for days at a time. The barn was massive, measuring nearly 100 feet long. The roof had caved in on the eastern side, dragging the supporting beams down with it into a chaotic tangle of splintered wood and rusted corrugated metal. Sawyer started clearing the debris by hand. It was back-breaking, agonizing work. His hands blistered and bled, calluses forming open sores. He lost weight, his body hardening into lean, sun-baked muscle. On a stormy afternoon, a freak summer thunderstorm rolled over the mountains. The sky turned a bruised, violent purple, and the rain came down in absolute sheets, turning the alkaline dust into a slick, treacherous mud. Sawyer took shelter in the farmhouse, watching through the broken window as the deluge washed over the property. When the storm passed an hour later, the air smelled of ozone and wet earth. Sawyer walked back out to the barn. The heavy runoff from the hill behind the structure had washed away a massive amount of topsoil near the center of the barn's dirt floor, an area Sawyer had not fully cleared yet. As he approached, something caught the afternoon sunlight. It was not wood. It was not rock. Sawyer grabbed his shovel and started digging frantically at the mud. The blade struck something hard with a loud metallic clang. He dropped to his knees, clawing away the wet earth with his bare hands. It was concrete, a thick, reinforced concrete slab buried beneath the dirt floor of the barn, and set directly into the center of the slab was a massive rusted iron wheel connected to a heavy steel hatch. It looked like the bulkhead of a submarine. Sawyer's breath hitched in his throat. He cleared the remaining dirt, revealing the full inch of the hatch. It was nearly 4 feet wide. He gripped the iron wheel and pulled. It would not budge. Decades of rust and sediment had locked it tight. He ran to his car, grabbing a can of WD-40, a sledgehammer, and a heavy towing chain. He sprayed the wheel, letting the oil seep into the ancient mechanism, and began tapping the edges with the sledgehammer, trying to break the rust seal. After agonizing effort, he gripped the wheel again and threw his entire body weight into it. With a deafening metallic screech that set his teeth on edge, the wheel turned an inch, then another. Sawyer kept spinning it until the locking bolts disengaged with a heavy thud. He hooked the towing chain to the wheel, ran the other end to the structural pillar of the barn that was still standing, and used a come-along winch to pry the heavy steel door upward. The hatch groaned, fighting him every inch until it finally crested its center of gravity and slammed backward onto the concrete slab. A rush of cold, stale air hit Sawyer's face. It did not smell like rotting vegetables or wet earth like a root cellar would. It smelled distinctly of machine oil, old paper, and something metallic like copper wire. Sawyer grabbed a heavy-duty tactical flashlight from his tool belt and clicked it on. He leaned over the edge. A heavy steel ladder descended into a darkness so profound it seemed to swallow the beam of light. He could not see the bottom. "Okay, Harlan," Sawyer muttered to the empty barn. "Let us see what you are guarding." He gripped the rusted rungs and began his descent. Some distance down, the air grew significantly cooler, a stark contrast to the boiling Idaho heat above. Finally, his boots hit a solid concrete floor. He swept the flashlight around, and his jaw practically unhinged. He was not in a bunker. He was in a cavern. The underground space was staggering in scale, at least the size of a football field, held up by massive steel I-beams and reinforced concrete pillars. It was an engineering marvel, something that would have cost millions of dollars to excavate and build. Sawyer stepped away from the ladder, his footsteps echoing loudly in the cavernous silence. He swept the beam to his left. Parked in perfect neat rows were vehicles, but not tractors. Sawyer walked closer, wiping a thick layer of dust from the hood of the nearest one. It was a classic Packard Twin 6. Beside it sat a pristine Cadillac Town sedan, and beyond that, a row of Ford Model A faux flatbed trucks. There were at least 15 vehicles, all perfectly preserved in the dry, temperature-controlled subterranean air. My God, Sawyer thought, his mind racing. This is not a prepper bunker. This is a vault. He continued walking deeper into the facility. Stacked against the far wall were hundreds of wooden crates reaching nearly to the ceiling. Stenciled onto the side of the crates were faded black letters. Canadian Club, Walkerville, Ontario. Bootleg whiskey, thousands of bottles of it. The pieces began to click together in Sawyer's mind. The location, Idaho, was a massive transit corridor during Prohibition for liquor smuggled down from Canada to supply the West Coast and Chicago. This was not just a stash house. This was a major distribution hub for an organized syndicate. And his great-uncle, or perhaps his great-grandfather, had been the gatekeeper. But why was it abandoned? Why was it left untouched? Sawyer walked past the mountain of whiskey and approached a chain-link cage at the very back of the cavern. Inside the cage sat a heavy Mosler Bank vault door, standing slightly ajar. His heart hammered against his ribs as he stepped inside the vault. The flashlight beam illuminated rows of metal shelving. On the shelves were canvas bags, hundreds of them stamped with the seals of long-defunct banks. First National Bank of Chicago, Union Trust, Pacific National. Sawyer reached out with a trembling hand and untied the drawstrings of the nearest rotting canvas bag. It was not paper money. Paper would have rotted or been eaten by mice. A cascade of heavy silver coins spilled out, clattering loudly against the metal shelf and bouncing onto the concrete floor. He picked one up, a pristine, uncirculated Morgan silver dollar. He looked at the shelves. There had to be tons of silver here, millions of dollars in raw numismatic and precious metal value. He was rich, staggeringly, impossibly rich. He let out a breathless laugh, the sound echoing through the vault. He turned around to leave the cage, to run up to the surface and figure out how to secure the hatch. But as the flashlight beam swept across the floor near the entrance of the vault, the light caught something that made Sawyer's blood run instantly cold. Lying in the dust just outside the heavy Mosler door was a skeleton. The remains were draped in the rotting scraps of a vintage pinstripe suit. But what terrified Sawyer was not the skeleton itself. It was the fact that the skeleton's right wrist was securely fastened to the heavy iron bars of the cage with a pair of police-issue handcuffs. Someone had not just abandoned this fortune. They had been trapped down here, left to die guarding it. Sawyer took a slow step back, his eyes locked on the skull. Near the skeleton's outstretched left hand lay a rusted Colt pistol and a brass key. Suddenly, a sound echoed from above. It was not the wind. It was a heavy metallic clank. Sawyer froze. He killed the flashlight instantly, plunging himself into absolute suffocating darkness. He strained his ears, listening to the silence of the tomb. Then he heard it again, the unmistakable sound of boots scraping against the concrete slab at the top of the ladder. Someone was coming down. Sawyer pressed his back flat against the cold steel wall inside the vault, holding his breath until his lungs burned. The absolute darkness of the subterranean cavern was suffocating, heavy with the weight of decades of buried secrets. A high-powered LED beam sliced through the blackness above, casting long, monstrous shadows down the ladder shaft. "I told you he opened it. The winch is set up," a voice echoed. It was smooth, cultured, but stripped of its earlier polite veneer. "Derek Langston. Should have just put a bullet in him when you had the chance, boss." A second, much deeper voice grunted. The heavy thud of tactical boots hit the concrete floor. "Too much paperwork, Vance. Horizon Ridge does not need a missing persons investigation holding up the land transfer. Besides, the nephew did the heavy lifting for us. Let us find him. He cannot have gone far." Sawyer peered around the edge of the heavy Mosler vault door. Two beams of blinding white light swept over the antique vehicles and the mountain of Canadian Club crates. Vance was a mountain of a man, carrying a suppressed tactical shotgun. Langston walked beside him, holding a sleek 9mm pistol, his tailored suit completely incongruous with the subterranean tomb. "Incredible," Langston breathed, panning his flashlight over the cars. "My grandfather was not lying. It is all here. Who built this place?" Vance asked, keeping his shotgun raised. "The Seattle Syndicate," Langston replied, his voice dripping with greed. "Roy Olmsted's operation." Olmsted was the biggest bootlegger in the Pacific Northwest, bringing in millions, but when the feds started tapping his phones, he needed a fallback, a treasury. "My grandfather, William Langston, was his chief accountant. He partnered with Sawyer's great-grandfather, a local dirt farmer who needed cash to excavate this vault off the grid." Sawyer's mind raced. Harlan had not just been a crazy hermit, he had been a sentinel. "So what happened?" Vance asked, stepping closer to the whiskey crates. "Greed," Langston sneered. "When Olmsted got busted, my grandfather tried to bleed the vault dry and flee to South America, but the Caldwell family caught him in the act. They locked him down here to rot and sealed the hatch. Harlan spent his whole life guarding it, too paranoid to spend the money, terrified the syndicate or my family would come looking for it. And here we are." The beams of light were getting closer. They were moving toward the chain-link cage at the back, toward the vault. Sawyer dropped to his hands and knees. He had no weapon, no phone, and no way out. The ladder was 100 yards away across an open floor. If he ran, Vance would cut him down in seconds. His hand brushed against the dusty concrete floor, searching frantically. His fingers curled around the rusted Colt near the skeleton's outstretched hand. He pulled it toward him. It was incredibly heavy, the slide fused shut with decades of rust. It was useless as a firearm, but as a heavy hunk of steel, it was something. Then his fingers found the brass key lying next to the skull. "He has got to be in the cage," Vance said, his voice echoing loudly. The heavy footsteps closed in on the chain-link perimeter. Sawyer had seconds. He looked at the massive Mosler door. It was nearly 2 feet thick, balanced on heavy greased steel hinges that had miraculously survived the decades. The locking bolts on the inside were still extended. Caldwell, Langston called out, his voice sharp and authoritative. I know you are in there. There is nowhere to go. Walk out with your hands up, and I will write you a check for $500,000. You can walk away. It was a blatant lie. You do not let a man walk away after showing him a suppressed shotgun and a skeleton. Sawyer did not answer. He slipped off his heavy leather work boots, wincing as his soaked feet touched the freezing concrete. He grabbed a rotting canvas bag from the nearest shelf, the one filled with Morgan's silver dollars, and hoisted it with his left hand, gripping the rusted Colt in his right. Suddenly, Vance's flashlight beam hit the rusted bars of the cage, illuminating the skeleton. Jesus, Vance muttered, stepping through the open gate. That would be grandfather, Langston said coldly, stepping in behind him. Check the vault. Vance stepped into the Mosler vault, his shotgun leading the way. The instant he crossed the threshold, Sawyer swung the canvas bag of silver dollars with every ounce of strength he possessed. The heavy bag struck Vance squarely in the side of his skull with a sickening crunch. The giant man dropped like a stone, his flashlight clattering across the floor, and his shotgun discharging a muffled thwip into the ceiling. Vance! Langston yelled, raising his 9mm and firing blindly into the dark vault. The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space. Stone fragments exploded from the wall right next to Sawyer's ear. Driven by pure adrenaline, Sawyer lunged forward, throwing his entire body weight against the edge of the 2-ton Mosler door. The heavy steel hinges groaned in protest, but the door began to swing. Langston scrambled forward, trying to stop it, but he was too late. Sawyer slammed the massive vault door shut just as Langston reached it. The booming reverberation shook the dust from the ceiling. Sawyer jammed the heavy brass key into the exterior locking mechanism and turned it with both hands until he heard the massive steel tumblers violently click into place. Silence descended on the cavern, broken only by the muffled, frantic pounding coming from inside the 2-foot-thick steel door. Sawyer slumped against the cold steel of the vault, his chest heaving, his body drenched in cold sweat. He had done it. He had trapped them inside the very tomb Langston's grandfather had died in. He picked up Vance's dropped flashlight, the beam cutting through the swirling dust. The pounding from inside the vault grew desperate, but Sawyer knew the door was rated to withstand dynamite. No one was getting out without the key, but Sawyer's problems were far from over. He was standing in a subterranean vault filled with stolen syndicate silver, illegal Prohibition whiskey, and a skeleton. If he called the local sheriff, the federal government would swarm the property. The IRS, the FBI, and the Bureau of Land Management would tie the estate up in litigation for years. He would lose it all. Sawyer walked slowly back to the ladder, his mind working with the cold, calculating precision of a man who had nothing left to lose. He climbed back to the sweltering heat of the barn, securing the iron hatch behind him. He did not call the police. Instead, he drove his battered Honda Civic into town and found a payphone. He dialed a number he had not called in years, a high-stakes corporate litigation attorney he had once worked with during his contracting days, a shark named Richard Sterling. Sawyer Caldwell. Sterling's voice crackled over the line. I thought you fell off the edge of the earth. Are you calling to ask for a loan? I am calling to hire you, Richard, Sawyer said, staring out at the baked Idaho landscape. I need you to draft an airtight legal strategy for the discovery of a historical treasure trove on private property with a clear, unbroken chain of title. No living claimants. There was a pause on the line. How much are we talking about, Sawyer? I have not counted it all, Sawyer replied evenly, but the silver alone weighs about 2 tons, and there is a fleet of mint-condition vintage luxury vehicles. Sterling exhaled sharply. Where are you? Idaho. Bring a team. And Richard, call the FBI field office in Boise. Tell them Horizon Ridge Holdings has 2 executives trespassing on my land, and they have managed to lock themselves inside an antique bank vault. I am pressing charges. The ensuing media circus was unprecedented. For months, Blackwood Farm was the center of the universe. News helicopters circled the airspace, and federal agents cordoned off the dirt road. The FBI extracted a severely dehydrated Derek Langston and a concussed Vance from the vault. Both were indicted for armed trespassing, attempted extortion, and a laundry list of corporate crimes tied to Horizon Ridge's predatory land acquisitions. The legal battle over the treasure was brutal, just as Sawyer had predicted. The state of Idaho tried to claim it under historical preservation laws. The descendants of Roy Olmsted's associates filed frivolous lawsuits. But Sawyer's title was ironclad because the cavern was structurally integrated into the deeded property and because the Langston family had no legal right to the syndicate's stolen assets. The federal courts ultimately ruled in Sawyer's favor under the law of fines and treasure trove precedent. To satisfy the historical societies, Sawyer agreed to donate the skeleton of William Langston and the operational records found in the vault to the National Museum of Organized Crime in Las Vegas. Sometime later, Sawyer sat on the wraparound porch of the newly rebuilt Blackwood farmhouse. The rotting siding had been replaced with beautiful dark cedar. The barn was fully restored, housing not rusted junk, but a museum-grade climate control system. He took a sip of coffee, watching the morning sun break over the mountains. His phone buzzed on the table. It was his sister, Brooke. He answered it. "Morning, Brooke." "Sawyer," she said, her voice carrying a familiar tight edge, though tempered with a new, distinct reverence. "Warren Ellison called. He said the auction house in New York finalized the sale of the first crates of the Canadian Club. He mentioned the figure. Sawyer, is it true?" "It is true," Sawyer said, leaning back in his chair. "And the Packard Twin 6 goes to the block next month. I cannot believe it," she whispered. "You are a millionaire, 10 times over. You were living in your car, Sawyer." "I was," Sawyer agreed, looking out at the sprawling acres of dirt that everyone had told him was worthless. "Turns out Uncle Harlan left me exactly what I needed. I just had to dig a little deeper." He hung up the phone, listening to the quiet rustle of the wind through the sagebrush. The land was still dry, still harsh, and still unforgiving. But to Sawyer Caldwell, it was the most beautiful place on earth. It was not a cursed patch of dirt anymore. It was an empire built on a foundation of silver and secrets finally seeing the light of day. If you were on the edge of your seat during Sawyer's unbelievable underground discovery, hit that like button right now. Real-life hidden histories like this are hiding right beneath our feet. Want to hear more incredible stories of ordinary people stumbling into mind-blowing, dangerous fortunes? Subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell, and share this video with a friend who loves a massive plot twist. See you next time.